He snorted. Then he would have written you off because you're female. You know, a woman really shouldn't live in that big house all by herself, some crap line like that. Don't tell me you can't. It was all over town by noon. Law sat at the table across from Lena, watching her pale, strained face and wondering if she was going to talk to him. Oh, she'd told him what had happened. Once they'd left the sheriff's office, she'd confessed what was going on, and he had been hard-pressed not to go through the roof of his car. No wonder she'd looked so pale. No wonder she'd looked so worried. Shit, why hadn't she called him? That night? Why hadn't she called him when it happened? He would have been there in a few minutes, been there with her. But hell, of course she wouldn't call him. Lena didn't look at him that way, didn't think of him that way. She might call him for a ride into town, for a ride to the county sheriff, but she sure as hell wouldn't call him when she needed a shoulder, in the middle of the night when she was alone, scared. When she heard some woman screaming. Screaming. Jennings. Keith Jennings. Law ticked through his mental file until he placed a face to the name, and he figured it could have been worse. Jennings was quiet, sometimes a little too quiet. In Law's opinion, he liked when people talked, did stuff, because that made it easier to figure them out. But Jennings focused on his job and tried to be fair and thorough, from everything Law had seen about him. In a small town like Ash, it was easy to watch, too. Watching was kind of his thing, anyway. Jennings did his job.
Yeah.
Could have been worse, could have been Prather. If that idiot had been on the night shift that weekend, Lena's report might still be in the process of being written. Hell, Prather might have tried to figure out a way to not even write the damn report. That man could fuck things up 7 different ways to Sunday and manage to make it look like the other person's fault. A soft, tired sigh drifted from Lena. Leaning back in the seat, Law crossed his arms over his chest. So, you going to tell me about it or what? I already did, she said, her voice weary. No, you told me exactly what you told the cops. You haven't told me how you are, what you're worrying about, thinking about. Things you'd normally tell me. You're not. You going to? She caught her lower lip between her teeth and then reached up, slipping her fingers under her glasses to rub her eyes. She had a headache. He could see it, tell it by the way she was rotating her neck, rubbing the back of it. Come on, Lena. Talk to me. I'm scared. I feel sick. I feel helpless. And I'm pissed off. Why are you pissed off? He asked. She smacked a hand against the table. Because there's somebody out there, or there was. Maybe it's too late, I don't know. But she needed help, she needed it, Law, and nobody helped her. And nobody can find her. Is anybody even going to look? Jennings did look, he said softly. You tried to help. You called the cops. Lena snorted. Fat lot of good it did. Slowly, she reached up and took off her glasses, revealing the pale, almost crystalline blue of her eyes. She'd been born blind in her left eye. Until she was 10, she'd had vision in her right eye, but she'd gotten injured playing baseball with some friends, and not wearing any safety equipment. Apparently it was a big risk for people who already had a vision impairment. She'd been hit in her one good eye and the injury had resulted in vision loss in her right eye as well. He loved her eyes. He knew she was self-conscious. Well, maybe that wasn't the right phrase. Lena wasn't always patient with people. She didn't mind people asking her questions, but too many people would rather stare than ask. She knew when people stared, she could feel it. She was too attuned to people, too sensitive. She wore the dark, tinted lenses because she had some idea that it might keep people from looking at her as much. Law could have told her it was a waste of time. People had a habit of staring at what they didn't quite understand. And then there was the case that with Lena, she was just one of those women that people noticed. She was attractive.
Yeah.
But it went deeper than that. She had that spark. Logically, he knew he wasn't looking at her from unbiased eyes. He thought she was absolutely beautiful. But she had something special. She had a way about her. People noticed her. The way she moved, the way she held herself, the way she laughed. Her confidence. Everything. And right now, he couldn't help but notice the strain on her face, and the very unfamiliar look of self-doubt. "It's because of me," she said quietly. "I know Sergeant Jennings at least made the effort to look around, but Prather? He didn't even bother. And it's because of this." She passed a hand over her eyes and shook her head. "If I could see, he would have paid a little more attention to me." Oh, bullshit, hear him saying something just like that. Oh, I can totally see him saying something like that. He already implied I should have some sort of companion. She all but spat it out, fury vibrating in her voice. Law narrowed his eyes. Companion? Yes. She sneered, the derision dripping off her words. It's a big house, too spooky at night. Somebody with me might help. If he thought it might help, he might have voiced the rage that made him feel. But he knew it wouldn't help her. Still, he had a vision of meeting up with Prather, telling the fool a thing or two, assuming he'd understand. I suppose you disabused him of that idea? There's no point. She shook her head. You know, he isn't that old. Why does he act like a dinosaur? I wonder if his folks were dinosaurs. Some people just have it in their genes, maybe, Law said, shrugging. Leaning forward, he covered her hands with his, stilled the nervous twirling of her glasses. You can't let him get to you, Lena. You know what you heard, and you did what you could. You can't do any more, he said quietly. If I could see, she tried to pull away, averting her face. A muscle twitched in her jaw. If you could see and you went outside without knowing what was going on, I'd have to wonder about your intelligence, honey. That's one of those TSTL things, too stupid to live. You don't go plunging headlong into something without knowing what kind of environment you're putting yourself into. Not smart, Lena. If it's a dangerous environment and you're not absolutely convinced you can handle it, then your best bet is to do just what you did, call for help. She made a face. Law laughed. It's the truth. When you dive into something, if you can't handle it, then you risk making 2 victims instead of 1. How does that help anybody? You're right. She sighed and rested her head against the padded bench. She closed her eyes, the thick fringe of her lashes lying against her ivory skin. I know you're right. I just wish. I don't know. I just have a bad feeling about this, Law. Really bad. All over town, damn it. They were talking about it all over town. How could she have managed to cause this much trouble? Fuck, it had been 2 a.m. and miles outside of town. One neighbor, only one. But that one neighbor had heard her. As he stopped at the counter to pay for a Coke and gum, neither of which he needed, he heard Adrian Cooper talking about it to Deb. He just barely managed to keep from snarling. Deb Sparks was more effective at getting news out than any modern media known to man. Tell her, and in a matter of hours, people who no longer even lived in Ash, who hadn't lived in Ash in 20 years, would hear about it. Family members who only visited every other year would hear about it. Hell, maybe the whole world. Not good. Not good at all. Judging by the strange glitter in Deb's eye, she was miffed, too. Probably irritated that she hadn't been the source of all the excitement instead of Lena. Too bad it wasn't Deb, too bad indeed. She might know how to spread the word, but she was also known for spreading less than reliable words. Somebody called out his name and he only paused a moment in the swinging glass door. I've got to get back, sorry. Yes, he had to get back. Had to figure out what to do. Had to decide. The drive back to his place hadn't yielded any miracle answer. Distracted, he paced the hard-packed dirt floor and studied his territory. It was dimly lit, the light provided by battery-powered torches or gaslights. Completely self-contained, completely his. He had spent a great deal of time in this place, perfecting it until it was exactly as he wanted it. Some of his tools and his toys he'd crafted with his own 2 hands. He took a great deal of pride in this place. His own little world. And he'd come close, too close to being discovered. If he was discovered, well, it had always been a risk, but he hadn't exactly envisioned it being a risk quite like this. Hadn't imagined it happening quite in this fashion. She was strapped down to the cot, her face slack, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm of deep, deep sleep. She'd tried to rouse twice, but he'd just given her more Valium. Right now, he needed her quiet. So he could think. He'd think easier away from here, but he couldn't seem to pull back just yet. It was like a drug, he realized, an addictive, dangerous drug that was sure as shit going to fry his brain if he wasn't careful. As close as he'd come to being caught, it had been such a thrill. And as chancy, as dicey as things were now, what was he doing? Cleaning up his trail? Getting rid of her? No. He was out here, all but whacking off and remembering it all over again. The hours he'd spent in town hadn't helped him find answers, and while he'd intended to go home and clear his mind, he hadn't been able to. What to do? Yes, somebody had heard her. But it wasn't like it was the most reliable witness. Nobody had seen anything. This was new. Unusual for him. To feel so unsure. And on the flip side, so exciting. Part of him raged at what she'd done. Part of him wanted her to do it all over again, so he could feel that rush all over again. Mouth dry, he stopped in the middle of the floor and turned back to look at the door. Right there. He'd barely made it inside before the lust got control of him. Once he'd caught her and gotten her back here, all he had been able to think of was taking her, hard, fast, brutal. He hadn't even attempted to bring a response from her this time. Once he'd gotten her back inside his spot, he'd slammed her against the dirt wall. With his hand over her mouth, he'd fucked her again, relishing every last struggle, every choked, muffled cry. She'd been unconscious when he was done, and as his mind cleared and his blood cooled, he realized he'd need to keep her that way for a while. Just in case. It had been a wise call. Even as he had gone about dumping her on the bed, he'd heard the distant wail of sirens. He hadn't panicked. Even then, he hadn't panicked. Panicking never served a wise man. Instead, he dealt with his girl, using a syringe to give her a heavy dose of Valium. It would keep her unconscious for the next little while. After taking care of that first, pressing need, he'd checked the door, made sure his place was still secure, still hidden. Then he'd gathered his belongings and debated, did he slip away? Did he wait here? Too close, last night had been far, far too close. He'd spent the morning in town, listening to the chatter on the gossip grapevine. After all of these years, after so much care, he'd messed up. He'd almost been caught. Now he had to decide what to do. Careful, he had to be careful now, even more careful than before. He had to think it through. Had to plan. While part of him insisted he kill her before this place was found, he knew that might not be wise. The sooner he killed her, the sooner he'd have to dispose of her body. That was always the riskiest time, aside from actually bringing her in. If he killed her now, then he'd have to get rid of the body soon, and people would be too watchful for a few days. Needed to wait.
Yeah.
That was best. Yes. Yes. That was it. That had to be the way. Besides, he couldn't make his plans until he knew what the sheriff's department planned to do about Lena Riddle's report. Lena Riddle. That was a hot topic in town today. Too many people talking about what she'd heard, whether or not she'd really heard anything, whether or not her sanity was in doubt. She wasn't crazy, though. And too many people knew that. That was the entire problem. Hope woke to the sound of rain, and her cell phone buzzing on the bedside table. She glanced at the display and grimaced. Huddling under the blankets, she sat up and answered the insistent ring. She could ignore it, but he'd just call back. And keep it up until she answered. Law was rather insistent that way. Hey. You're not here. No. I'm not there. I'm here. And where is here? He asked, his voice level. He wasn't mad, she knew that. He was worried, and he'd continue to worry, and she could tell him she was a grown woman and could take care of herself, but that was a lie. She absolutely sucked at taking care of herself. He was just being Law, but she suspected that if she told him she was at a hotel only 12 miles from his place, he might get mad. So she kept that quiet. At a hotel. It's in Kentucky, she said. I was just too tired to finish the drive and now, well, I need a day or two. For what? I just do, she said, keeping her voice flat. For a moment he was quiet, and then quietly, he asked, Are you okay? She knew what he was asking. I'm fine. Really. I just need some time. I'll be there soon. Okay? Over the line, she could hear him sigh.
Yeah.
You told me that last week. You actually coming? Law, I told you I'd be there, she said. I already am here. I just need to get my head on straight. Not that she was very likely to do that in the next 24 hours. She really had planned on heading back to his place the day before. But something about the confrontation with the deputy, and then the strange, tense minutes that followed after he'd left, had set her on edge. And that guy. The blonde. Why had he affected her like that? What was the deal? She was so jumpy right now. A door had banged in the room next to hers and she'd flinched. She was literally 5 seconds away from hiding under the sink counter. She might not get her head on straight, but she could at least pretend that she wasn't just a whisper away from the funny farm. Funny farm. Uniforms. Shaking her head, she thought, it's almost like old times. Hope?
Yeah.
I'm here. Sorry, I'm just thinking. Look, I'll be there. When? Law asked. You've been telling me this for weeks, and then another week passes and you never show. She sighed, rubbing the tense, aching muscles of her neck. She couldn't even explain exactly why she wasn't there right now. It wasn't like she was far away. It wasn't like she had a whole hell of a lot of money either. She was down to her last couple $100. But she needed to settle her brain, settle herself, especially after the episode earlier. She couldn't do that in the few minutes it would take to get to his place. She knew she couldn't, but she also couldn't go there until she was a little less on edge. Hope? She swallowed and closed her eyes.
Yeah.
You're not coming, are you? The flat, grim sound of his voice made her wince. I am coming. She closed one hand into a fist, fought the tears that rose in her throat. I am coming. I need a couple more days. Silence hung between them and finally, Law sighed.
Yeah.
Whatever. But she could tell he didn't believe her. I'll be there, Law. Damn it, she couldn't keep running. She had to stop at some point, at some time, and the time was now. I'll be there. 3 more days, Law. I'll be there in 3 more days. You're sure? Yes, Law. 3 days, Law. I promise. A huge sigh whooshed out of him. Good. Good. She could picture him, clear as if he stood there, running his fingers through his hair and smiling that way he did when he got his way. And that's what had happened. He was worried about her and he wanted her someplace where he could take care of her, and that meant having her closer to him. If she wasn't so desperate, if she had any place else she could go, if she didn't really need a friend, there was no way she would do this. She didn't want to lean on anybody and she didn't want to need anybody. But it was Law. If she was going to put her life together, hell, she didn't have a life right now. She had to build one, and she needed a friend, she needed a job, she needed a place to live. Law was her best, and only, friend, and he was offering the job, and that would help her find a place to live. If she couldn't let herself lean on her oldest, dearest friend, then she couldn't really lean on anybody. Maybe she should have more pride, but considering the hell her life had been the past few years, she knew how very little pride actually meant. She had her freedom, and she had a friend willing to help her. That had to mean more than pride. Quietly, she said again, I'll be there soon. Then she hung up the phone and stared at the mirror. It was Monday, a rainy, dreary Monday. Lena lay in bed, listening to the rain falling outside and trying to work up the interest to get dressed. After the hell of yesterday, when she'd finally lain down, she'd gone straight to sleep, dropping down like a stone. But dreams plagued her. Dreams plagued by a woman's screams. Dreams where Lena was running through the woods, being chased. Chased by some nameless, faceless monster. Dreams about Ezra. She'd had another one of those dreams, full of heat and hunger and lust and laughter. Ezra's humor, that sexy innuendo as he talked to her, except, of course, he wanted to be friends. Because he wasn't ready to get involved. He needed to get his head on straight, and what in the hell did that mean anyway? And then her dreams circled back around to that night, of the woman and her screams. God. Closing her eyes, she clenched her jaw and tried to tell herself she'd done everything she could do. There was nothing left for her to do. She'd called the sheriff's office. She'd gone out there. A fat lot of good it had done. Down on the floor, Puck shifted, giving a little doggy yawn, followed by an impatient yip. Lena rolled onto her back and rubbed her hands over her eyes.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll be up in a second, she muttered. He yipped again. Despite herself, she had to smile. Let me guess, it's 7:05. Reaching out, she pushed the button on her clock and grinned as the voice recited the time. Yep. 7:05. The dog's internal clock was as reliable as any man-made clock. Come 7:05, it was mealtime. She could feed him a little earlier, but never any later, not without hearing it from him. Blowing out a breath, she sat up and kicked her legs over the side of the bed. She needed to get up anyway. It might be a rainy, dreary Monday, but it was Monday. And on Mondays, she had a standing breakfast date. Anything weird happen last night? The concern-in-law's voice was a balm to her soul. Lena might not have accomplished anything with her visit to the sheriff, but Law believed her. He was one of her closest friends and she knew she could count on him. No. Just a quiet night. Quiet, but plagued by restless dreams, sex dreams, and nightmares. They were on their way into town for breakfast at the Nook Cafe. For the past few years, they'd had breakfast there just about every single Monday. Although she was dead tired, she hadn't cancelled. She needed to get out of the house and relax, stop brooding. You want to go by the sheriff's office again after breakfast? He asked. Lena blew out a disgusted sigh. What would be the point? Because you deserve to have some sort of answer? They don't have one. She grimaced and tried to relax. Tension had her muscles tied into knots. They didn't see anybody, didn't find anything. I don't think there's much more they can do. Her hands were damp, she realized. Cold and clammy. Look, Law, I don't really want to talk about this right now. I need a break from it. It's all I've been able to think about since it happened. Sure. He reached over and caught her hand, squeezed it gently. Turning her palm up, she laced her fingers with his. He had strong hands, calloused, gentle. Just being around him made her feel safer. It took 20 minutes to get to town and by the time they got there, the cafe was already packed. I'm going to let you and Puck out at the door. I'm going to have to park down the street. I see Roz's car, so she's probably already got us a table. The car stopped and Lena waited as Law hopped out. Behind him, somebody honked their horn. Rolling her eyes, Lena asked him as he opened her door, "Did you double park?" "No. I'm not parking. I'm unloading," he said. She could hear the grin in his voice. The other door opened and then shut. Puck was at her side and she gripped his lead. Forward, Puck. The rain was cold and the wind gusting down the street didn't help. By the time she made it to the door of the cafe, her clothes were soaked and her hair was dripping. Puck shook himself and she scowled as he flung more water on her. The bell over the door chimed as she opened it. "Hey, Lena." It was Cassie, the granddaughter of the cafe's owner. "Hi. Is Roz here?" "Yep. Front corner, near the windows. I'll walk you over." "Nasty day, huh?" Lena reached out her hand and caught Cassie just above the elbow. "Damn nasty," she agreed as the young woman led her to Roz's table. "You look like you got a little damp." She snorted. "A little damp."
Yeah.
That about described it. And now she smelled like wet dog. Shivering, she breathed out a sigh of relief as Roz called out her name and said, "I've already got coffee waiting for you, Lena." "Gimme." She slid into a chair as Puck settled down under the table at her feet. Halfway through the first cup, she started feeling almost human. Nature is screwing with us, she muttered. 88 degrees one day and then 62 today and pouring down rain. I hate it. And I hate cold rains. You and me both, Law said, joining them. He took the chair at her right. Lena reached for her coffee, but she did it a moment too late. Law had already helped himself. Damn it, get your own coffee. That's the thanks I get for letting you out at the door so you don't get soaked. Roz snorted. Oh, that's as much for your benefit as hers. Tapping her fingers on the tabletop, Lena said, if you don't give me my damn coffee, Law, I'm going to beat you bloody. Violent woman. He pushed the cup into her hands. She kept it close against her until he got a cup of his own. I hear you had a rough weekend. Carter, Roz's husband of 4 years, spoke up, his voice low and quiet. He was a soft-spoken man, and until he got to know somebody he kept to himself. That he was even asking her about her weekend was, she knew, a sign of his affection for her. But she still didn't want to talk about it. Rough enough, she said, cradling her nearly empty coffee cup. Is there anything we can do to help? Carter asked. No, she softened the curt response with a smile, shaking her head. Not much anybody can do. Roz reached over, covering Lena's hand with her own. You know, you're welcome to stay with us for a while. So you wouldn't be alone. You know we've got the room. Just then, Puck shifted by her feet,